Staring out through the church hall windows, Donald Rich considered it may be less depressing to be outside, amidst the damp blanket of mist that smothered the building, than seated inside. This was partly due to the nature of the structure itself, which had neither been designed to hold a sizable gathering, nor maintained properly in the years since it had been built. But the more pressing issue was the nature of the two very different groups of men who were currently packed inside, awaiting a briefing on their forthcoming mission. Well, at least in terms of two of those men in particular. The personality clash between their respective leaders, seeming destined to end in physical confrontation. On the whole, the various airmen and sailors who were present, which included Rush himself, were fairly easygoing types. Most had already survived some degree of active service, and as such, were fairly well-humoured and slow to temper. Sadly, the same description could not be applied to their leader, Commander Stanley Shepherd, a man whose adversarial nature seemed difficult to fathom, even when set against the various traumas he was rumoured to have experienced during his military service. On its own, Shepherd's dark and humourless demeanour might perhaps have been tolerable, were it not for the uncompromising nature of his opposite number, a senior police detective named Amos Armitage. Amongst those they commanded, both men were afforded a high level of respect, each bearing the physical injuries of prior conflicts, a slight limp being discernible in Armitage's gait when he walked, and the far more visible scarring to be seen on the right side of Shepherd's face. But the interactions that Rich and the others were witnessing between the pair were becoming ever increasingly volatile. One story he'd heard alleged that the two had violently clashed during a previous assignment that had resulted in the hanging of a captured German pilot. A more lurid tale, however, pertained to the female detective who regularly worked alongside Armitage, and a love triangle having developed between her and the two male supervisors. Regardless of its origins, these tensions had already necessitated Armitage's deputy, a dour Scot named Finlay, having had to physically intervene between the two. Alongside this, the reasons why the two services were being asked to work together had yet to be made clear by those who had assembled them. This had inevitably only aggravated the situation further between their leaders, as their men also felt a marked lack of trust between themselves and their opposite numbers. And so as the doors to the cramped building slammed open behind them, announcing the entry of their respective supervisors, the men inside rose hurriedly to their feet, waiting to discover what urgency had pulled them from their other duties to this small and desolate island off the southeastern coast of the country. It was Shepherd, the young naval commander who delivered the briefing, apparently for once able to suppress his irritation at having to work alongside the assembled police officers. Having paused for several copies of a handwritten map of the island to be distributed amongst the audience, he then began to relate what was expected of them. Foulness Island had been under the control of the armed forces since the time of the Great War, and had been used for the testing of differing forms of military equipment. From the earliest trials of tracked fighting vehicles and armed flying machines, the island had played host to ever more intricate weapons of war, and at the outset of this conflict, with scant possible hope of victory in sight, Foulness had become the site of a series of ever more desperate experiments. In a small area at the centre of the island, a mock-up of a typical rural British village had been created to test methods needed to repel any German invasion from across the Channel. Nicknamed Hunchester by those who had assisted with its construction, this small cluster of buildings had been subjected to all manner of weapons. For the past few months, the site had been used exclusively for the testing of poison munitions, with a series of pressurized tanks installed directly at the centre of the village. These allowed instructors to release differing blends of noxious gases in large quantities, and to evaluate how they might affect either an attacking or a defending force. Several days prior, one of the lead scientists on the program had apparently lost his senses, screaming that his work should be forever hidden from any man, regardless of nation. Disturbed midway through causing extensive damage to the laboratory he was working in, the worker had fled the scene, taking with him a quantity of samples and notes. After a search that had encompassed the entire island, the technician had eventually been located in Hunchester, where MPs had tried to effect his arrest. But only one man from this team had emerged from the village, his lungs ravaged by a combination of poison gases the fugitive had managed to release from the holding tanks. It would now be the job of the team assembled here to relieve the soldiers currently guarding the village, before entering and apprehending the suspect. The priority of this mission being the retrieval of the samples and notes still in the man's possession, over the preservation of his life itself. The chorus of unease that had taken up amongst the men in the church hall only intensified, as Shepherd related how they would be forbidden from carrying firearms. Having paused temporarily to motion his audience to silence, Shepherd explained it was not known exactly what range of gases could be produced using the tanks in the village. There was a possibility that firearms or explosives could detonate the gas when used under certain circumstances, and so non-lethal methods instead were to be used. In addition to this, and in order to avoid the fate of those who had already entered the village, any member of the team chosen to do so would be wearing protective clothing. These were another experiment, which had been underway in the project at the time of this incident, and it involved repurposing naval diving gear to protect against chemical attack. With the broad scope of the mission now explained, Shepherd began to identify the tasks expected of each of his personnel. Whilst the assembled soldiers were well trained in the application of force, they had little experience in the pursuit or apprehension of criminals. As such, a small team comprising service personnel and police officers would be entering the village in search of the fugitive, working together to locate him. Shepherd had identified Rich and a pair of other Marines as members of this party, along with himself. They would be joined by the two senior detectives, Armitage and Finlay. No man present could miss the irritation the naval commander clearly felt from having to give this order, nor the mild satisfaction on the features of his policing equivalent. Then, with the strategic points around the village tasked out to the remaining personnel, Shepherd had dismissed everyone to take up their positions, as the protective suits that he and the rest of his party would be wearing were carried in and placed on the floor of the building. As he and the others had been assisted into their protective suits at the church hall, Richard listened intently to the briefing being provided by the technicians. A variation on the existing naval Sladen suit, each apparatus had been streamlined to allow ease of movement, while still retaining the suit's protective qualities. As this briefing continued, Rich did not fail to notice the attractive female detective he had heard rumours of assisting Armitage into his suit, nor the sideways glance of his own superior officer. Pushing the politics of the situation to one side, he accepted the heavy wooden baton that had been passed to him by one of the team's detectives, and then a set of metal handcuffs. Then he and the others made their way through the fog to a waiting army transport, slowly adjusting to having the thick material of the suits impeding their movements. The subsequent lorry ride across the island was short and conducted in complete silence, with police officers and soldiers staring sullenly at one another from either side of the vehicle. And then they were at the allocated drop-off point, waiting at the rear of their transport as the unprotected members of the team took up post around the village perimeter. This seemed to take an eternity, as each pair set off into the fog, a few disgruntled soldiers from the island's garrison emerging a few minutes later to mount up in the transport. Then, with a wave of his hand, Shepherd indicated for the small team to move forwards, down a narrow path towards the waiting cluster of houses and shops, the fog around them increasing in intensity with each uncertain step they took towards their destination, and taking on a yellow and toxic presentation. They were still a little short of the village outskirts, when Armitage had suddenly called a halt to the march, crouching down and motioning for Finlay to join him. Peering through the glass faceplate of his suit, Rich observed the two men run their gloves through the dirt at their feet, before motioning at the barren landscape around them. Following their hand movements, he realised there was an utter lack of vegetation anywhere on the ground before them, leading right up to the edge of the town. Wherever the yellow tendrils of fog that surrounded them touched the ground, there was now no living thing to be seen, all plants and trees instead replaced by a collection of dark material that had once been vegetation, punctuated here and there by an exposed animal or bird skeleton. Huddling together to speak in hushed tones once the two policemen had returned to the group, Shepherd emphasised the need to conceal their movements. The combination of gases that had been released into the atmosphere around them were clearly capable of destroying any living thing they came into contact with. If their quarry was not located quickly and unawares, then it was possible he would be able to compromise their suits, or release an even more dangerous gas combination. Nodding in acknowledgement, Rich's grip on the baton he held tightened reflexively, before he again set off, in company with the rest of the party. Pausing at each intersection between the empty buildings, the group peered out into the fog in search of the technician believed to be hiding there, each man preparing to break into a run and hurriedly subdue the fugitive before their quarry could make the environment any more hazardous to traverse. Rich had just emerged from a search of one of the empty buildings when the Marine beside him grunted and dropped down onto one knee unexpectedly. Stepping forwards to find out what the issue was, his eyes widened as he observed the shaft and flight of a rudimentary arrow wedged deep into the right shoulder of the soldier's suit. And as the Marine's hand took hold of the main body of the projectile in order to remove it, Rich could achieve little more than cry out, his warning arriving far too late, as without making any sound, the figure before him suddenly collapsed in on itself and folded down onto the ground in an untidy heap, all living flesh inside the suit quickly dissolving as the yellow fog from outside flooded in through the breach caused by the arrow's removal. Rich was still staring down in shock at the crumpled suit on the ground before him when there was a choking cry from nearby. Looking up, he now saw a second figure falling forwards onto the ground, one hand clasped tightly around an identical arrow, jutting out from deep within the opposing shoulder. Running half-hunched through the fog across to the figure, he quickly realised it was his commanding officer, similarly incapacitated by an invisible attacker. As his head turned wildly from side to side in search of their assailant, Rich was suddenly slammed to the chest by a violent force and pitched down onto his back. Looking the length of his body, he saw that a third arrow was now projecting up from the lower chest of his suit, prompting him to emit a cry of horror. Within moments, a suited figure was leaning over him, offering words of comfort, the distinctive Midlands accent identifying his protector as Inspector Armitage. There was a sudden commotion, and then a fast-running intruder emerged from a nearby patch of fog, wearing a suit of a different configuration. Rich had just enough time to cry out a warning to Armitage, having glimpsed a blade being held high in the intruder's hand, before the two men collided and began to roll around on the ground. Armitage gripping the hand, holding the knife down towards him tightly, as his attacker pushed down hard with all his might to embed it within the officer. Looking down helplessly from the arrow that protruded from his suit, and then across to the struggle, Donald Rich agonised over the consequences of intervention, before another figure pushed clumsily past him, barrelling into the attacker atop Armitage, yanking an arrow free from its arm, plunging it hard into the attacker's neck. Both suits immediately then deflating, as the deadly and corrosive gases that surrounded them flowed in freely through the fresh breaches that had been made. Rich's gaze meeting the horrified look on the downed policeman's face as he tried to comprehend the sacrifice that Commander Shepard had just made to save their lives. Both men, lying silent and stunned as the last two members of their party arrived, all trying to process the grisly scene that had now been enacted. Their mission completed, but at a cost that none could have expected, would ever have needed to be paid.